There is something the history books almost never tell you about the Roman legions. Not the battles, not the formations, not the famous discipline that turned common farmers into the most effective soldiers the ancient world had ever produced. What they almost never tell you is what happened after the fighting stopped. After the march ended. After the sun disappeared behind the hills of Gaul, Germania, Judea, Britannia, or the deserts of North Africa. What happened when a Roman soldier tried to sleep? Because buried inside that question, hidden inside the routine of every night, in every campaign across 5 centuries of Roman military history, is a secret that reveals more about how Rome conquered the world than any description of a legion in battle formation. And by the end of this video, that secret will change the way you understand what the Roman army actually was. Stay with this to the end, because the answer is not what it seems. The Roman Empire, at its peak under the Emperor Trajan in approximately 117 CE, covered roughly 5 million square kilometers of territory. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal to the borders of Mesopotamia in the east, from the sands of the Sahara in the south to the forests beyond Hadrian's Wall in the north. It was the largest administrative entity the Western world had ever seen, and the primary instrument of its construction was the Roman legion. At its height, Rome maintained between 25 and 30 active legions simultaneously. Each legion consisted of approximately 5 Sadursarent to 6 Sadursarent fighting men. Alongside the legions marched auxiliary units, non-citizen soldiers recruited from conquered territories who could double or even triple the effective fighting strength of a Roman field army. The campaigns of Julius Caesar in Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE involved Roman forces regularly numbering between 40 Caesuran and 60 Caesuran soldiers. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, conducted by the future Emperor Titus, required an army of somewhere between 60 and 80 Caesuran men. The conquest of Dacia, completed by Trajan between 101 and 106 CE, involved estimates of 150 Caesuran to 200 Caesuran Roman soldiers across both campaigns combined. These numbers moved. They marched, they occupied, they built, they fought, and then, every single evening, without exception, they slept. Or tried to. Here is the first thing to understand. The Roman legionary was not merely a soldier. He was a construction worker, a surveyor, a laborer, a cook, a carpenter, a ditch digger, and a sentry, before he was ever asked to rest. And the order of those activities matters enormously. A standard Roman march covered approximately 20 to 25 Roman miles per day under normal conditions. A Roman mile, the mila passuum, was approximately 480 meters, making a standard day's march somewhere between 29 and 37 kilometers of ground covered on foot. In forced march conditions, a legion could push beyond that. The historian Appian of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd century CE, records Roman armies moving at a pace that could reach the equivalent of 30 miles in a single day when strategic necessity demanded it. The men who covered that distance did not walk unencumbered. Following the military reforms introduced by the consul Gaius Marius around 104 BCE, the standard Roman legionary was required to carry the vast majority of his equipment on his own back, reducing the army's dependence on slow-moving baggage trains and making the entire force dramatically more mobile. This burden, the sarcina, was suspended from a T-shaped wooden carrying pole called a furca. The images on Trajan's column in Rome, which can still be seen today, show this arrangement in stone. What was inside that sarcina? His weapons and armor, including the heavy scutum shield and the lorica segmentata, or chainmail, depending on the period, along with his gladius short sword and 2 pila javelins. His entrenching tools, a dalabra, which combined a pickaxe and a hatchet, in a single implement and a shovel. Wooden stakes for the palisade wall. Cooking equipment, a small bronze pot, and a hand-grinding stone for processing grain rations. Spare clothing, personal effects, 15 days' worth of rations, primarily emmer wheat and hardtack, and his half of the leather tent his contubernium would share. Modern experimental archaeology and historical analysis suggest that this load approached between 55 and 65 kilograms in total weight. Ancient writers themselves acknowledge the burden. They called the legionaries who carried it muli Mariani, Marius's mules. After 25 to 37 kilometers of ground covered under that weight, a Roman soldier still had not slept. He had not even begun the process that would eventually lead to sleep. Because before rest came construction. Every single night, without exception. This is not hyperbole. The Roman military writer Flavius Vegetius Renatus, whose 4th century work De Re Militari remains the only surviving complete Roman military manual, was unambiguous. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE after personal observation of Roman armies in the field, was equally precise. And W. Smith's Dictionary of Classical Antiquities, drawing on both ancient sources, summarizes the reality bluntly. The Roman army never halted for a single night without constructing a fortified camp capable of containing all its fighting men, animals, and baggage. Not most nights. Not when the enemy was close. Every night. At the end of a day's march, the first act was not to eat or rest. It was to build a city. A specialized advance party, tribunes and centurions, had gone ahead of the main column during the march itself to select and survey the campsite. The tool used for this survey was the groma, a Roman surveying instrument that allowed right angles to be established with precision over open terrain. By the time the main body arrived, the site had already been laid out. The position of the commander's tent, the praetorium, at the center, the main street running through it, the via principalis, and the arrangement of each unit's position in the grid already marked. What followed was organized labor at industrial scale. The perimeter ditch, the fossa, was dug first. In a standard Republican-era legion-sized camp of the type described by Polybius, the surrounding ditch was approximately 5 Roman feet wide and 3 Roman feet deep. One estimate, based on Roman foot measurements and standard camp dimensions, calculates that completing such a perimeter required between 200 and 600 man-hours of work, distributed across more than 2,000 men working simultaneously. The excavated earth was thrown inward to form the agger, the rampart. On top of the rampart, wooden stakes, the sudis, or valli, were hammered into place to create the palisade wall. The whole process, from arrival at the site to completed fortification, took between 2 and 5 hours, depending on soil conditions and troop numbers. The historian Livy tells a story about the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus on campaign, whose soldiers were in the act of constructing a camp when a junior officer rushed up breathlessly to report that the enemy was visible nearby in perfect position for a surprise attack. The young officer urged the consul to suspend construction immediately and seize the opportunity. Paulus refused. He mounted the tribunal, addressed his men, and ordered the camp to be finished before any movement against the enemy was considered. The camp was not optional. The camp was doctrine. Inside that camp, once it finally existed, the soldier encountered the structure that would govern every hour of the night. The fundamental unit of Roman military sleeping arrangements was the contubernium. The Latin word means, roughly, tenting together. It was a group of 8 legionaries who shared a single tent, a single pack mule, a single set of cooking equipment, and an intimate daily life that continued through every march, every campaign, and often every year of a soldier's 25-year service obligation. The tent itself was called the papilio, butterfly, a name that Roman writers believed referred to the similarity between a rolled leather tent and the chrysalis of a butterfly, and the spread tent itself to the insect's wings. The papilio was constructed primarily from calf skin or goat skin, treated to resist moisture. It measured approximately 10 Roman feet by 10 Roman feet in its floor plan, roughly 3 meters by 3 meters, and stood approximately 1.5 meters tall at the center pole. Into that space, 8 men arranged themselves to sleep. The men of a contubernium were not strangers assigned to the same address. They marched together, cooked together, built camp together, and over years of shared hardship developed the kind of loyalty that military historians have consistently identified as the actual foundation of Roman battlefield effectiveness. They were called contubernales, tent mates. The senior man among them was the decanus, typically the longest-serving member, responsible for ensuring the tent was raised properly and the interior maintained to regulation standard. 8 men in a space of 9 square meters. No mattresses, no blankets in the modern sense. The primary sleeping insulation for a Roman legionary was his cloak. Either the sagum, a rectangular piece of unwashed wool fastened at the shoulder with a metal brooch called a fibula, or the heavier pennula, a semicircular hooded garment that in cold climates covered the entire body. The wool used for these cloaks was deliberately left unwashed, preserving the natural lanolin in the fiber, which made the fabric nearly waterproof and provided significant insulating value even when damp. The cloak that protected a man from rain during the march was the same garment that served as his bedding at night. They slept on the ground, on leather, on packed earth, sometimes on straw if the local terrain permitted it. Around them, pressed close in a space barely adequate for the purpose, were 7 other men, their weapons stacked near the entrance, their personal gear arranged around the perimeter, the smell of sweat, wet leather, smoke from the campfires outside, cooked grain, animal dung, and damp wool filling the confined interior. The Roman army valued discipline and order. It did not value comfort. But here is where the real architecture of a Roman soldier's night becomes something more than a physical description. Here is where it becomes something closer to a system of controlled sleep deprivation, engineered with the same precision Rome brought to road construction and siege engineering. The Roman night was divided into 4 watches, called vigiliae. Each vigilia lasted approximately 3 hours, though the exact duration shifted with the seasons, since the watches were calibrated to sunset and sunrise rather than to a fixed mechanical clock. In winter months, in northern provinces like Britannia or Germania Inferior, the night watches extended longer as darkness stretched across more of the day. A winter watch on the Rhine frontier could feel, to the man standing it, significantly longer than the same assignment in summer. The 4 watches ran from approximately the 6th hour afternoon, what we would call 6 in the evening, to sunrise. First watch, 6 in the evening to 9 at night. Second watch, 9 at night to midnight. Third watch, midnight to 3 in the morning. Fourth watch, 3 in the morning to 6. At every moment during those 12 hours, some portion of the camp was awake and armed. The sentries stood at the 4 gates, the Porta Praetoria facing the likely enemy direction, the Porta Decumana at the rear, the Porta Principalis dextra and Porta Principalis sinistra on the flanks. They stood at intervals along the rampart. They stood beside the standards, the sacred military insignia whose loss meant collective disgrace for a unit. They stood outside the praetorium, the commander's tent. They stood near the baggage, near the horses, near the artillery, and they were inspected. The inspection system was not casual. Commanders called circumitores, literally those who go around, later designated by the formal rank circutores, moved through the camp at irregular intervals during the night, checking each sentry post, confirming passwords, verifying that every assigned position was occupied by a man who was awake. The password itself changed nightly. A tablet bearing the night's watchword was passed from the commander's headquarters down through the chain of tribunes and centurions to the soldiers standing guard, creating a verification chain that required an awake and attentive sentry at every link. The consequence of failure at this system was not a reprimand. Polybius, in Book 6 of his Histories, describes the penalty for a Roman sentry caught sleeping at his post with the same clinical precision he brings to everything else. The punishment was called the fustuarium, the cudgeling. The offending soldier was brought before a court composed of all the military tribunes. If found guilty, the tribune touched the condemned man with a wooden cudgel, a ceremonial initiating gesture. And then every soldier in the camp was permitted, and in some circumstances expected, to beat him with clubs and stones until he was dead. Polybius adds that even soldiers who survived the immediate assault by escaping the camp could not return to their homes because their families were forbidden from sheltering them, and Roman society treated them as permanent outcasts. The penalty was death, and the consequence of surviving the penalty was a kind of social death. Polybius's observation about this system is precise and worth preserving. Because of the extreme severity and inevitableness of the punishment, the night watches of the Roman army are most scrupulously kept. So consider the arithmetic of what this created. A Roman legionary on a standard campaign marched between 29 and 37 kilometers under a load approaching 60 kilograms. He arrived at the campsite and immediately participated in 2 to 5 hours of fortification labor, digging, hauling, cutting, hammering. He then ate if rations and time permitted, and then, in a 9-square-meter leather tent pressed against 7 other men, he attempted to sleep for approximately 6 hours, because every man in a contubernium rotated through watch duty. 2 men from each tent group were on guard at any given time, which meant that across a single night, every man could expect to be assigned at least one watch shift of approximately 3 hours. Sleep before the watch, wake for the watch, return from the watch, sleep again if the remaining hours allowed it. This is not a description of rest. It is a description of managed exhaustion, and it continued for days, for weeks, for months. Caesar's Gallic campaigns lasted 8 years. The conquest of Britannia under Emperor Claudius initiated a Roman military presence on the island that endured for nearly 4 centuries. The Dacian Wars consumed multiple campaign seasons of brutal terrain, harsh winters, and continuous movement. Throughout all of it, every night, the same process repeated. March, build, stand watch, sleep in fragments, wake before dawn, dismantle the camp, resume the march. The ancient historian Josephus, who observed Roman armies directly during the Jewish War of 66 to 73 CE, wrote in his work Bellum Judaicum that the Romans made their camp before they engaged the enemy, and do not go to battle before they have walled themselves in. He identified this practice, this obsessive nightly construction, and its attendant discipline, as the primary reason Roman armies were so difficult to defeat. They could not be caught unready. They had engineered unreadiness out of the campaign calendar entirely. What did the men themselves experience inside this system? Here the sources become fragmentary, but fragments remain. Letters preserved from the Vindolanda tablets, a collection of wooden writing tablets excavated near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, and dating to approximately 85 to 130 CE, give glimpses of the texture of garrison life. Soldiers wrote home requesting warm socks and underpants, specifics of clothing inadequate to the northern climate. One tablet records a request for servsam, beer, suggesting that the men found ways to soften the edges of a life built almost entirely from obligation and discomfort. The camp was not only deprivation. The spaces between assigned duties, between drilling, building, standing guard, and marching, contained what military historians have identified as genuine social life. Soldiers gambled. They played dice and a board game called tabula, the precursor of backgammon, whose boards have been found scratched into the stone floors of forts across the empire. They repaired equipment, wrote letters, visited the bathhouses that accompanied permanent fortifications, and spent time in the civilian settlements, the canabae, that inevitably grew up around long-occupied Roman camps. The contubernium itself functioned as the basic unit of this social world. 8 men who shared a tent, a mule, a cooking fire, and years of shared hardship created bonds that the Roman military system explicitly relied upon. A man did not fight for Rome in the abstract. He fought and marched and stood his cold watch in the 3rd hour of the night for the 7 specific men who would be asleep in the Papilio when he returned. The shared tent created accountability that no formal structure could fully replicate. In the close quarters of the Papilio, a man's courage or cowardice, his illness or laziness, his competence or failure were visible to the same 7 men every night for years. They knew when a tentmate woke in the night from a noise that might signal danger. They knew when he returned from watch duty exhausted, and when he returned from it, frightened. That intimacy was not incidental to Roman military effectiveness. It was, the evidence suggests, one of its core mechanisms. The physical environment of sleep varied enormously across the geography of the empire. In the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, the leather papilio became a heat trap in summer and an inadequate shield against temperature drops that could approach freezing on winter nights in higher elevations. In Britannia, soldiers stationed along Hadrian's Wall, a structure of stone and turf running 117 kilometers across the breadth of northern England, garrisoned from approximately 122 CE onward, faced conditions that the Mediterranean-trained Roman military system was not originally designed for. The Vindolanda tablets confirm what the climate record suggests. Soldiers stationed in the north found the cold genuinely threatening. The requests for woolen socks and extra undershirts were not complaints. They were logistical necessities. Permanent fortifications that housed legions for extended periods eventually replaced the leather tent with stone barracks. The barrack blocks excavated across Roman Britain, at Caerleon in Wales, at York, at Chester, show paired rooms assigned to the contubernium, a smaller front room for equipment storage, and a larger rear room for sleeping. The rear room was still called the Papilio, preserving the name of the leather tent it had replaced. 8 men in stone walls instead of leather, but the same basic structure. The contubernium as the fundamental unit of Roman military life and sleep. The winter camps, castra hiberna, were different from the summer marching camps, more substantial in construction and intended for occupation across the cold months when campaigning paused. Legions stationed in Germany during the Rhine campaigns of Augustus and Tiberius in the early 1st century CE developed permanent winter positions that grew over generations into permanent fortresses. Some of those fortresses grew into cities. The modern city of Cologne, known in Roman times as Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, began as a Roman military settlement. The city of York, Eboracum, began as a legionary fortress established around 71 CE. Lancaster, Lincoln, Gloucester, Chester, all bear, in their street plans and their names, the ghost of the Roman castra from which they grew. The men who built those empires of stone slept first in leather tents on the ground, with the smell of sweat and smoke around them, one ear open for the sound of the circummeter making his rounds. And now, the thing the title of this video promised. The thing that will surprise you. Everything described above, the nightly camp construction, the 4 vigiliae, the fustuarium for sleeping sentries, the contubernium system, the papilio tents, the sagum cloak used as bedding, is not primarily a story about sleep. It is a story about what happens to the boundary between sleep and wakefulness when you deliberately, systematically, and permanently erase it. Rome did not try to protect its soldiers' sleep. Rome used sleep, or rather the controlled denial and management of sleep, as a weapon. Consider what the system actually produced. An army that could never be surprised in its sleep, because it never fully slept. An army that built a defensive position before it rested, every single time, so that the act of sleeping was itself protected by the same engineering that built roads and aqueducts. An army whose soldiers, through years of fractured nights and early waking, had been conditioned to function under conditions of exhaustion that would incapacitate men without that conditioning. The Muli Mariani, Marius's mules, were not just physically adapted to carrying 60 kilograms across 37 kilometers. They were cognitively adapted to operating on 4 to 6 hours of interrupted sleep night after night for years. Their enemies, almost universally, were not. The Celtic tribes of Gaul and Britannia slept in their homes or their camps without systematic guard rotation, without fortified perimeters, without the disciplined infrastructure that made Roman sleep a strategic asset rather than a vulnerability. The Germanic tribes east of the Rhine, the Dacians in the Carpathian Mountains, the various peoples of the Iberian Peninsula who resisted Roman conquest for generations, all of them, when they faced Rome in the field, faced an enemy that had transformed the most vulnerable moment in any army's daily existence into a controlled, engineered system. Josephus saw it clearly. Polybius described it precisely. Vegetius systematized it in writing. But the deeper insight, the one that sits underneath all their technical descriptions, is this. The Roman army did not build its camps because it was afraid of the dark. It built its camps because it understood something that no other military force of the ancient world had fully internalized. That war does not stop at sunset. That the night between battles is not a pause in the conflict. That an army which sleeps as civilians sleep dies as civilians die. Caught flat, unformed, unfortified, and unready. The camp was not shelter. The camp was doctrine. The last Roman garrison in Britain withdrew around 410 Fadid CE, as the Western Empire began its long contraction. The legions that had camped on every piece of ground between Rome and the Atlantic, between the Sahara and the Scottish lowlands, left behind something more durable than the stone walls of their fortresses. They left behind cities: Lancaster, York, Chester, Cologne, Vienna, from Vindobona, the Roman fort established on the Danube around 15 BCE, Budapest, from Aquincum, a legionary fortress on the same river. The street plans of dozens of European cities still follow, centuries later, the grid laid down by a Roman tribune with a groma and a morning to spare before the march resumed. Those cities began as castra. They began as the temporary fortifications raised at the end of a day's march by exhausted men who knew, before they could rest, they had to build a wall. And so the final irony of the Roman soldier's night is this. The men who slept the worst, who were most systematically deprived of uninterrupted rest, who woke before dawn in leather tents pressed against 7 other men. Those men built the infrastructure of civilization that millions of people still inhabit today. They did not sleep well. They slept strategically. And the world they built is still standing.